Good morning.
Good morning.
Henry, we can begin anytime you're ready.
Oh, I'm ready. It's good to see everyone. Good morning again. And I just want to thank the Building Industry Association and the Central South Carolina Realtors Association for allowing the Columbia Chamber to be a part of this important webinar conference and for giving us the privilege of welcoming all of your attendees. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure for me. Each year you come up with great topics and great information, and the things that you cover each year, it helps keep housing as a top priority, at least in my mind, in the Midlands. And not only that, it provides information and it creates conversations that help us implement strategies that make us, in our region I'm talking about, a lot more business friendly. Chambers are about improving the business climate, and that's why we are so privileged to partner with both of your organizations on this event. I congratulate all of the ones who've made the commitment to be a part of this webinar. I congratulate the members of your organizations for the hard work you do. We see you throughout the community. We are privileged to work with you and to help you make this region better. And if there's anything the Columbia Chamber can do to help you make the climate in this region much more conducive for growing your businesses, let us know. Again, thank you, and we appreciate the invitation.
So also, I'd like to welcome everyone to our first ever virtual Midlands Real Estate Forecast. In addition to the folks at the Columbia Chamber and CCRA, we welcome for the first time the Lexington Chamber as one of our partners for the Real Estate Forecast. My name is Earl McLeod. I'm the Executive Director of the Building Industry Association of Central South Carolina. And it's my job and pleasure to thank and recognize our sponsors for your forecast this morning. Clark's Termite and Pest Control, Coldwell Banker Realty, Dominion Energy, D.R. Horton, Eastwood Homes, Great Southern Homes, Grow Financial Federal Credit Union, McDonald and Associates, attorneys and counselors at law, and Mungo Homes. Thank you so very much. We cannot do this program and many of our organization's activities without you. We appreciate your support more than ever in these weird days that we're experiencing. So thank you for being part of this conference, and I know we're going to have a great presentation for you to enjoy.
Thanks, Earl. Good morning. My name is Kim Fuller, and I'm the Co-Executive Officer of Central Carolina Realtors Association. I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker for today. Dr. Jessica Louts is the Vice President of Demographics and Behavioral Insights at the National Association of Realtors. The core of her research focuses on analyzing trends for both NAR members and housing consumers. Through management of surveys, focus groups, and data analysis, she presents new and innovative ways to showcase results. Jessica discusses research findings in major media outlets and international presentations. Jessica received her doctorate of real estate from Nottingham Trent University in the UK. She also has a master's in public policy from American University and an undergraduate degrees in political science and law and justice from Central Washington University. Dr. Louts, thank you so much for being with us today. And
Thank you.
Before I turn it over to you, if anyone has any questions, if you would put it in the chat box, and we will make sure to answer those questions at the end of the panelists.
Right, awesome. I am psyched to be here today. So I'm in Arlington, Virginia right now. I wish I was honestly with you guys in person and we could see each other. It is pouring down rain outside, to give you just the context. Also the context of I have 4 cats. They are completely insane. I'm insane for having 4 cats. There's also a dog who lives here, but she's scared of the rain, so I think she'll stay downstairs. So at any moment, my laptop could land on the floor. You might hear an end table pop over. Anything, it could happen, but hopefully everyone will just stay snoozing like they are right now. So I named my presentation The American Move When the Pressure Cooker Dings, because I think right now we are all in a pressure cooker situation. So we know that real estate is booming. That's the good thing. But if you have a child at home right now, I just think you're a saint, because I don't know how everyone is doing it right now, thinking about virtual learning, thinking about an adult child who could be back with you, because we know now that 52% of adult children, young adults who are the ages of 18 to 29 are at home, 52%. So anyone who is in that situation, both an adult child, but then also the parents, are probably all feeling like this is a pressure cooker. With COVID, with the election, with hurricanes, with fires, I think we can all say, wow. I think that there's a lot of people who put decisions for their family on the back burner. They could have had a time frame that was a few years out. And right now we've essentially just put us all in an Instapot, and it's not a slow cooker anymore. It's not a slow plan for our future. It's essentially, we have to do this now. And so a lot of people are making that move, and that's really how this all connects to real estate. So let's take a look at the numbers and what we're looking at right now. We have an unprecedented real estate market. We actually have a 25% gain, nearly 25% monthly gain in home sales last month. And when we see that gain, it follows another 20% gain that we just had the month before. So all of these headlines and the press releases that we're putting out, they're all saying, this is historical, we've never seen this before, but we keep putting them out because the gains are so strong. Everyone's talking about this alphabet soup of what's going on with the economy and what kind of recovery we're looking at. When we look at housing, at least, what we're seeing is this deep V down, and we are there on that deep V back up. We are close to, if not at, pre-pandemic levels, because buyers have really come back into the market from either pausing or from jumping into the market and saying, this is the time for me, I have to make this move. What's happening though with this is that those buyers are there, the demand is there, but the supply, the housing inventory, especially the affordable housing inventory, that's not there. And so what we've seen with this environment, it's just pushing up home prices. We have 101 months of year-over-year home price growth. We've collected this data back to 1968. We have never seen this strong of home price growth. And in many communities, you're seeing double-digit gains in home price growth. That is really, really good for homeowners. It is very difficult for a home buyer to then enter, save their down payment, and especially for a first-time home buyer to be able to make that purchase. What we also see is that we actually have, this is the data that we have released in the past. I'm going to show you new data that we just released at 10 a.m. this morning, so we passed that mark. I can show you this data, but it's 22 days is the typical list to contract time. That is the lowest we've ever recorded in our data set, and I'll show you that it actually goes down to the teens right now. And half of members are saying that the market is hotter than normal. Now, this is data from a couple weeks ago. We have a survey that we're closing this morning. I actually talked to my colleague and I was like, hey, you want to close that survey, get a jump start on it? We'll start analyzing the data this afternoon. I saw a sneak peek at the data, and this is not crunched in any way. It's not weighted, but 58% of members are now saying that the market is hotter than normal. That is crazy when we think about the start of school week, that this is post Labor Day, that the survey is in the field right now. Most of the time, people start thinking about the market settling down. We're heading into the fall, not a lot of purchases. So this is really an interesting time in the market. When we look at, again, this typical market on the market time, what we can see now is it's 16 days. This was just released this morning. We've never seen this before. This is really, a lot of homes are moving very fast. And it used to be those homes in the city centers and urban areas, they were the ones that were moving fast. No. So what we're seeing now is a lot of people, these rural homes that may have been overlooked, could have sat on the market for months before you had a qualified buyer who was really interested in taking on this property and perhaps land. Now they're moving quickly too. And so that's really bringing down this time on market. We had seen at the beginning of the pandemic, you can see this blue line here is looking at the median time to close. It's actually pretty steady now. So it had gone up just a little bit, getting closer to that 40-day mark for that time to close, but now we're back down to 36 days, bouncing around a little bit there. But we are knowing that the transaction is moving and it's closing on time. So we are seeing that those delays that were happening in the process, we found ways to work through them, whether that's electronic signatures, documents, using PPE to show listing tours, making sure that everyone's safe in that transaction, but the time is actually back to the normal state at this point. The other thing that we're seeing here, and what I think is really interesting, is that this is a leading indicator. This is the mortgage home purchase application. So people are back in the market. And again, you can see this deep V down of this yellow line, and it's back up. Now it's nearly 28% higher than it was last year for mortgage applications. So we really are seeing that a lot of people are saying, wow, I want to take advantage of this mortgage interest rate that is under 3%. Lock that in, because if I'm a first-time home buyer, that means more home for my money. If I'm a repeat buyer, that means that that's actually going to get me out of the home, that maybe I have a good loan product in, I've refinanced, I'm feeling good about this, but this is not the right home for me and my family anymore. And I'm ready to actually make this move. I can't not take advantage of these low interest rates. We saw at the beginning of the pandemic that a lot of people were refining. So back in March, everyone was taking advantage of these refi products. And we still see a lot of refis that are happening right now, people taking advantage of that. But there are a lot of purchase applications that are being had right now too. So that was just an overview of what we're seeing, broad macroeconomics. I'm going to jump in now to looking at consumer data that we're collecting in different waves. We're collecting them in different timeframes. We switch up the survey questions, so I'll let you know as the time frame changes. But then I'm also going to show you some demographic trends and what we're seeing too. So let me jump into that part. So these are buyers who had been in the market in the past, and now they've come back into the market. So they could have taken a pause in their transaction, wanted to assess their economic, their health situation, and now we're back in the home buying market. And so we asked them a couple questions here. Do you feel comfortable essentially attending an open house for a home that's listed for sale? 55% saying absolutely, ready to go. 21% are saying, yeah, I've already done that. I'm recently active in going to an open house. So there's a smaller share here who are saying, I need assurance from either my local government, from medical authorities to feel okay doing this. And 17% are saying, I just don't feel okay going to an open house. I need a medical breakthrough. So a vaccine, the COVID numbers to drop remarkably to really go into this open house situation. Okay, so that's an open house. A lot of open houses have actually been put on hold though. Brokerages and even locals have actually said, this is not going to be happening in my local area. What is happening though are listing presentations. So let me show you some better numbers on this. The listing presentations, asking again, consumers, do you feel okay doing this? This is asked last week in August. They're overwhelmingly saying, I'm either active in this or I am ready to go. So absolutely not necessarily needing a medical breakthrough because, and I have to thank the realtors out there who quickly adopted the protections that were needed for consumers to feel okay doing this. And I think that was an incredibly quick thing that happened. And if we compare this to different industries, so thinking about going to the movie theater or going to a restaurant inside, shopping mall, I think a lot of us are feeling weary, on some end of the spectrum about whether we feel okay doing these things, going to a sporting event, which I think we all really miss sports at some point. And so watching this happen and seeing how quickly people are feeling A-okay with going to a listing presentation, I really think speaks to the strength of the industry, but also the recovery. And so we can really see that that has contributed to that deep V back upwards. So let's talk about the behavior here. This one I think is fascinating. We ask consumers when thinking about the pace of your home search, how do you feel? We actually see that nearly 40% are saying, I am very ready to buy sooner rather than later. I am not going to sit on the sidelines. If I find that home that's in the right budget, I am ready to go. There are some that are saying I'm not really rushed or I'm stalling the process, but the largest share are actually saying I am ready to go and I'm feeling a little urgent about this. We asked them some follow-up questions about why. and 52% said that they are concerned about their physical health. So COVID is playing a role here, likely in saying, I need a less dense neighborhood, so a place where I can walk on the sidewalk without a dozen people and their dogs and their kids strolling around. I need some place where I can have my own place to live. We also see that share here, 14% are saying, I'm tired of living where I'm living, staring at these four walls. I need perhaps a bigger place, and I'll go into that data. But then we also see 14% are saying, I have got to separate from the people I'm living with. So perhaps those young adults are saying, I got to make that move. Perhaps we will see this divorce boom. There's been a lot of fodder about that, but there's also been a lot of fodder about a marriage boom coming out of this. So we'll have to see what happens there. Those numbers could settle out. But then also 20% are saying, I'm concerned about social unrest. Now I have to say that this survey was done the first week in July. It's July 8th. That's the wave of the survey. We know that there were a lot of peaceful protests that happened during that time frame. And so that really could be leading into that. Just people saying, I'm in a city center. I'm tired of just concerns about COVID. I'm tired of social unrest. And so I just need my own place in a rural area. So seeing those numbers are pretty interesting to me. The other thing that I think is fascinating right now, and this, we're jumping back to the August survey, was that during the pandemic, have you seriously considered or started looking at purchasing a second home? There is a share of people, a considerable share of people, 28%, who are actually considering a second home. I think this is fascinating when we look at this data. I don't have historical data on this, but I think it has to be higher, knowing the number of second homes that are out there is significantly lower than this. I think there's a lot of people who have these condos in the city, a townhouse in the city. They've seen their spending go down on entertainment, on clothes. All you need is a shirt, right? You can wear sweatpants on the bottom. It's fine if you have Christmas pajama pants on, you're good. And so I think there's a lot of people who are cutting their spending on other aspects, and they're putting it either into remodeling their home. We've already seen that spending go up. But they're also considering, maybe I just get a second home. Maybe I find a place where I can go and spend a month. I can do my virtual work. My child can do their virtual learning, and I don't have to worry about the commute. And maybe I do go there more often as we move forward, as we don't have vacations that perhaps are as luxurious outside the country moving forward. So I think this is an interesting dynamic, but it really helps in the real estate market. It also makes it very interesting as we look at things like Airbnb that now have that monthly stay button. And you're like, ooh, maybe I can just go out to the country for a month and not have to worry about being in my own property that I'm so sick of. So I think this is a pretty interesting one here. So going back into the research that we've done among members. So this is based on a member survey. What we know, and not only member surveys right now, but past member surveys. So let me walk you through this one. So we know that a lot of people are doing homework online. They're looking at virtual tours. They're looking at virtual listings. They're dreaming on Realtor.com or the Z word. What type of property would be the perfect property for them, for their family? You dream about the pool in the good weather, whatever you want in this dream kitchen, etc. And we know that this is different from what we've seen in the past. In the past, what we have seen is that buyers were standing in their coffee shop, they were waiting in line, they're looking at homes, they're texting to their agent, they're texting their mom and dad, and everyone goes through that home as a huge group, and really probably complicates that transaction as mom, dad, stepmom, stepdad, and so on are all in that home tour. So this is a different type of homework that people are doing today. The other thing that we know is when they actually go and search for homes, that's a different thing too. In the past, when we look at pre-COVID numbers, if we go back to 2018, what we saw is that people were looking at a dozen homes before they put down a contract. They look for a number of weeks, you go with them, you see the homes, they're ready to go, they finally put a contract down. Last year, 2019 data, what we saw is that people looked at 9 homes before putting down a contract. So fewer homes, there were fewer homes to see, there was less inventory in the market, even pre-COVID. What we're seeing now is they've done their homework online, they're strategic, and they're only looking at 3 homes before they put down a contract. If I had said that just a couple of years ago, you would have laughed me out of the room, because that is like an HGTV dream that you're going to see 3 homes, not waste all this time, be strategic, put that contract down and be ready to go. Now, some of this is due to the lack of inventory. There may only be 3 homes in that price range, but some of it is you are doing your homework online. They're looking at these virtual tours. They can understand what this home looks like, but they want to see and feel what it feels like to be in that home, what the neighborhood really feels like. Yep, there's a cat on my desk. Cool. I am going to upgrade my office one day and I'm going to have a door, and that is going to be amazing. We also know that sellers are prepared right now. Adios, kitty cat. We also know that sellers are prepared right now. Oops. She's fine. And their DIY projects, half of members are actually saying that they're working with sellers beforehand to make sure that their home is ready to go, so that they're maybe FaceTiming through the home and saying, what can we fix up so that your home is ready to go? So sellers are doing their homework too, looking at the neighborhoods that they can move to. The other big changes that we're seeing, and I'm going to dive into some of this, is that 35% are actually saying that they're changing at least one home feature that they want in their home. So that could be this home office with a door, please, but also looking at a bigger yard. So, and top of the list for what they want to do with that yard is actually grow their own fruits and vegetables. I think that's fascinating. And that is like the Victory Garden come back from World War I days. People really want to be self-reliant right now. They also want acreage in the pool and the yard for exercise. But number one is growing their own fruits and vegetables right behind the home office. Also wanting that bigger kitchen, perhaps do all their canning and their sourdough starter in. I'm not entirely sure, but that's, I think, an interesting transition, because again, this is not stuff that people had wanted. A home office was very passe as we all got laptops in the 1990s and late 1990s. And so thinking about that now is pretty funny. We're also seeing that a quarter of members are saying that buyers who have come back to the market had been looking at a city center, now looking at small towns, at suburbs. I have to say though, and I want to underscore this, is that millennials are the largest generation of home buyers. Okay, we said the word millennials. Millennials range from their mid-20s all the way up to 40 years old. So they are a very large generation. They are the largest adult generation that's out there today. And so anything they do as a force in the market, they say they're the largest generation of. They are the largest generation of buyers. A quarter of younger millennials last year purchased in small towns. So they were already looking for affordability. They were already looking for a single family home for more space that you can't get in the city center. So again, a lot of this is a continuation of trends that we're already seeing. But again, we're in this Instapot, we're in this fast forward button, something that perhaps had been a back burner, but now is really accelerated as a trend. The other shift that we're seeing is a shift towards single family homes from multifamily properties, 13% making that transition. All right, so I mentioned briefly earlier about the protests. And I think that we can't turn on the news without seeing, one, the horrible fires on the West Coast right now. I'm from Seattle area originally, and it's just heartbreaking to see all of these fires. But we also can't turn on the news without seeing the protests. And I want to say that those are heartbreaking too, and it relates to housing, it relates to this industry, and I think it's important to just understand what that relationship is. So I'm going to dive into some of that right now. When we look at the homeownership rate by race, what we see is some massive differences here. Now, I only have this going back to 1994 because that's what's available on the US Census website. Of course, these problems have been here much longer. The Fair Housing Act was established in 1968 that said that you cannot discriminate based on race and housing. Now, right now, the spread between the Black homeownership rate at 42.1% and the white homeownership rate at 73% is as wide as when the Fair Housing Act was instated. The gap is actually wider, to tell you the truth. And so this is a very, very disturbing gap. And we can see here, just on this small chart of this very small time frame, go away, that we can see that this gap here, that it goes up, and it goes up during the boom years. And what we know based on the research that's out there, based on data that's out there, is that Black and Hispanic families were targeted for faulty loan products, for no-doc loans, even if they qualified for better loan products. And then what happened in the bust years is that they lost their homes at double the rate as white families. And so this is an extremely disturbing data point to know this, and to know that it just caused a further retreat in the homeownership rate among race. But I think that there's a lot to understand about this. There is a lot of systemic racism and a lot of problems looking at this data, but just looking at what happened last year, when we look at the applications for mortgages among successful home buyers, so those who eventually entered the home buying market, who did buy a home, what we see is that the denial rate for mortgages for Black African Americans was 13% compared to white Caucasians of 5%. And these are successful home buyers. These are people who did not get discouraged from the process, who didn't say, oh, I guess I can't buy a home, You know, I'm just going to have to save for a longer period of time, or maybe I'll wait until I can either be in a couple or find a roommate to purchase a home with. These are successful home buyers. And so I think that this is just a very discouraging point here, but I want to bring it back home to the protests and what we're seeing with this continued wealth and income divide. And when we look at the wealth divide, when we look at this, what we see is that, again, the gap here is extraordinary. When we look at the household wealth, the family net worth of those who are white, non-Hispanic, it's $171,000 compared to those who are Black, African American at just nearly $18,000, but not at $18,000. That is an enormous gap. And what we know is that a lot of this is just a housing gap. It's a homeownership gap. Housing is the #1 way that people have built their nest egg and their net worth in their family. And so this becomes a very disturbing point here when we look at this gap here and know that a lot of it really does stem from homeownership and being left out of the home buying market, truly being shut out of the home buying market. Now, the other thing that I want to point out here is that this is Federal Reserve data, and this was updated last in 2016 by the Federal Reserve. And you may think that there's a typo on this chart, that I'm missing a line here. The line that I'm missing is the Asian Americans who are on the homeownership chart and looking at that gap. Unfortunately, the Federal Reserve just lumps all of Asian Americans into the other multiple race category. And that, I think, in itself is just something that is incredibly disturbing, that we can't even separate out Asian Americans onto this chart. All right, so I'm going to move forward. I'm going to shift gears quite a bit, but I do think it's important just to take a look at what's going on in the country and know that we have a role in the housing industry to really try and close this gap and make this tighter moving forward. All right, so possible demographic shifts. The first one that I'm going to be talking about is multi-generational homes. And I touched on that a little bit. So I talked about how there is the largest generation right now of 18 to 29-year-olds who have come back home or they didn't leave. And some of that has to do with colleges going virtual or going in person and now going virtual. But some of it also has to do with people doubling up because they were living in city centers and they said, I'm paying rent in a small condo with a small apartment. And you know what? Why don't I go to mom and dad's house? They have a bigger pantry, their freezer is fully stocked, and I won't be having to pay rent in the smaller place with an elevator, and so they are moving back. But the other thing that's happening, and we know this, is that there is a big shift towards older adult relatives who were in senior centers, senior living centers, and so now they're actually moving in with their family. What we have seen in the past pre-COVID is that 1 in 6 Gen Xers and younger boomers purchased a multi-generational home. Now, this used to be a boomer issue. We used to see that the boomers were the sandwich generation. They're taking care of aging parents, aging kids. They could have a kid under the age of 18 in their home. They're paying for everyone, and they're really taking care of everyone and very stressed out. What we see now is that Gen Xers are actually taking this on as well. So they're the little generation that's wedged in between the boomers and the millennials, and no one talks about them. You watch Reality Bites, and that's all you get of Gen Xers. No one else cares. What we see, though, is that Gen Xers are also becoming this panini generation who are squished between these two large generations, but they're also taking care of everyone too. And I think this is important to understand as we watch this going forward, is that millennials are also starting to take on this multi-generational housing. We're seeing the share of them who are approaching 40, who are actually taking care of or having aging parents move in with them as well. So I think this is a very interesting dynamic and something that is likely to increase with COVID. It already has increased, and I think we're going to see this dynamic change. We already know that pre-COVID, there was the highest share of home sellers who were selling to move to be close to friends and family. So even if they weren't living in the same home, they wanted to be in the same neighborhood. And I think this is a very interesting dynamic where families are living with each other for long periods of time. If they're not living in the same home, they are actually selling to move closer to friends and family. Now, a lot of this has to do with, when we look at the data, is that childcare costs are really, really expensive in this country. It is $2,000 to $3,000 for a kid to go to daycare, and that is really, really difficult for many families to be able to pay for that. What happens as a result is that you see this family dynamic changing. You see people living with each other, and who's taking care of who. Maybe that aging parent is taking care of the kid, maybe the kid's taking care of the aging parent, and so on and so on. The other thing that we know has happened with these childcare costs is that there has been a baby bust in this country. We have birth rates at more than a 35-year low. People are not having children like they used to, and a lot of this has to do with finances. So when we look at those who are buying homes right now, what we know is that that has dramatically changed. When we look back at the 1980s, 58% of Americans had children under the age of 18 in their home when they purchased a home. Today, it's just 35% of home buyers had kids under the age of 18 in their home. So that dramatic drop changes what people look for in a home, the size of the home that they need, the type of neighborhood that they need. If you have a kid versus you don't, that really changes things up. What has been talked about a lot is that we're going to have this big baby boom coming out of this, and that come kindergartens 5 years from now, we're going to have a bunch of kids named Pandemica or Clorox or something along these lines. Just don't know if I believe it. And the reason why is because this baby bust has really been driven by finances. What we also know is there's a lot of millennials who are the number one generation to have lost their jobs during this pandemic. And so if we think about them as the child rearing generation, I just don't know if they're going to be able to swing it and have a baby boom come out of this. So I think we're probably going to see a continuation of this baby bust. That being said, if you're working remotely, if your spouse is working remotely, maybe you take advantage of it. I don't know. And maybe in 9 months, we will see a little bit of a baby boom coming out of this, but I'm a little more skeptical of that. All right, I'm going to move pretty lighthearted over here. And this is where my cat, like now she's just playing with a toy in the corner as opposed to trying to knock my computer off. So this is her moment and she's not here. These are all the animals that live in my house because I'm insane. We have 4 cats and a dog. And what I know is that looking at all of these headlines, there's a lot of people who are equally as insane as I, and they adopted all of these pets during the pandemic, and they cleared out shelters across the country, and they said, I want a companion, something to do with my kids, to entertain them besides a screen, but also I have time to train them and love them and so on and so on. So we have seen this clearing of the shelters, and this absolutely relates to housing. We have seen for unmarried couples, for single families, it is more important to be near a dog park, to be near walking trails than it is to be near good schools. That is a fascinating trend in their home buying. It also is very important for people to have a place that has a fenced yard and a doggy door, and it becomes more important in rural areas and in urban areas. I guess the suburbs are just saying we already have that, don't worry. But we are seeing that this is really a driver in people deciding to purchase, but then where they end up purchasing and the home that they purchase. I think it's a fascinating trend. I bought the house before I added in all these pets, so I guess I'm just pretty crazy. All right, so the next trend. This is the demographic makeup of first-time home buyers and what their household composition was since 1981. And when we look at this data, what we can see is that there has been a drop in those who are married couples who were purchasing. But what we also know is this mirrors the marriage rates in the country. So if we look just at the overall broad marriage rates in the country, what we see is looking back at the 1960s, more than 70% of American adults were married. Today, just half of American adults were married. Let's shut them. All the single ladies, raise your hands up. I got it. That's cool. All right. What we know, though, is unfortunately, while the marriage rates have dropped and while the buyers who purchased their first home as a married couple has also dropped, single females, it peaked during those boom years, 27%, a lot of single females purchasing her first home. That's amazing. But it's dropped off. It's now at 17%. It's a little disheartening to see this data, but we also know that this is coupled with affordability challenges, with inventory challenges, and she's likely making a less income as her single male counterparts. So we have seen this share drop off. What we have seen happen over this time period, though, is a rise in unmarried couples to the highest level we've ever seen, 17% purchasing their first home as an unmarried couple, the biggest financial investment of their life without being married. That is awesome. Go and do it. But we've also seen a jump in roommates who are purchasing homes together. So I think those single females could be coupling up in different ways, purchasing a home perhaps as a roommate, I'm already renting as a roommate. Let's go forward and move together and purchase a home together. We've actually seen it jump up to 4%. I think that this year could be the year of the roommates as people creatively say, you know what, I want to buy a home. I want to be out of this tiny apartment that I'm living in. Let's find someone to go and do this with, get a legal agreement in place. So I think that could be an interesting dynamic. All right, first-time home buyers. They are under the historical share. They are just at 33% in the last year. Historically, we want them to be at 40%. We want them to be higher, and we have not seen that. Now, we do know at the beginning of the pandemic, they are very much influenced by tight credit conditions. There's a lot of refis, and a lot of lenders really tightened up, and they said, nope, your credit score has to be higher, a down payment has to be higher before we can get you into a home. Now, what we have seen in monthly data that we're getting back is that the first-time home buyer share could actually be ticking up. These are annualized figures that I'm showing here. The monthly figures, if we see that ticking up, could be very interesting because there could be a lot of first-time buyers who are saying, you know what, I'm no longer wedded to the city center. I don't have to be in this expensive metro area of New York, Boston, DC. I can move to a more affordable place to live, actually be a first-time buyer, take advantage of these low interest rates if I can find this bigger property in a small town in the burbs. And so I think this is a number that will be interesting to watch in the next year as first-time home buyers do take advantage of the situation they're in of working remote and these low interest rates and really couple that to purchase their first home. The other thing that we know is that a third of first-time home buyers use down payment help from friends or family to be able to enter their home. So there's a lot of pressure that's put on first-time home buyers about saving for their first home, but we know there's a lot of reliance on first-time home buyers using help from friends and family. Now, I have to say that this really exacerbates the wealth divide that's happening in this country right now, which is truly the worst that we have seen historically in a very long period of time, I believe since the Great Depression. And this really complicates situations as we know that some families can help with the down payment. They can tack with their own equity of their home, or they have savings. There's a lot of families who cannot help with this. And so perhaps this is where we see people are doubling up. Perhaps that's a way to help as well. We saw last year in a pre-COVID situation that a quarter of first-time home buyers were actually moving from mom and dad's home directly into homeownership, skipping that rental proposition, saving up for that down payment, perhaps getting their debt to income ratio in check. So that's an interesting dynamic that is perhaps helping if they can't give a cash help of down payment assistance. The other thing that could help right now for your first-time home buyers who are out there is this one of the first stimulus packages really helped on student loan debt loads. So what we saw is that student loan debt essentially went to a 0% interest rate for federal student loan borrowers. So not for not for private loans, but for public federal student loans. Now, this is a really, really good thing if people could take advantage of it, if they were gainfully employed, if they could really tackle this debt. And the reason why I really want to underline this is that 47% of student loan debt holders last year were in a situation where they were in a negative amortization loan. They owed more on their debt, even with on-time payments, even being a good citizen and making their on-time payments. They owed more the next quarter than they did this quarter. And so this really becomes this huge hurdle for these student loan debt holders to be able to tackle this debt because they're making these payments and they're really just not tackling the principal of that debt. So this stimulus package, bringing it to 0%, really is this leg up if someone is gainfully employed and can tackle it. Now, on the flip side of this, student loan debt also automatically went into forbearance. So you didn't have to make these payments. If you had a high interest debt, like a credit card or something like that, maybe you tackle that debt, or if you have been, unfortunately, through no fault of your own, furloughed or been laid off, then this is one less thing to have to worry about right now. Without the interest tacking on. So a couple of things there with student loan debt, but if you know a student loan debt holder, just have them check their account because trust me, I have a lot of student loans and no one told me, my lender did not send out any materials and I did not know until going onto the website several months later after this happened. So do have them check that out so they can try and figure that information out. All right, number 4, agent use. This is where I get really excited because what we're seeing right now is that the agent use is extremely high, and it's even more important right now during the pandemic than ever before than what we've seen before. So when we look right now, 89% of people are using an agent to purchase a home. Even if they're buying directly through a builder, through a builder's agent, they don't necessarily feel comfortable doing that. And so they want agent representation on their side. And we're seeing that people are saying, you know, I want this representation to use an agent through the process to negotiate the terms, to find me the right property, to actually walk me through and show me what is the good home, what is the beautifully staged home that could have the leaky roof, how do I figure all this stuff out? So we really are seeing this agent representation being extremely important. We also know that on the sales side, 89% of people are using a seller's agent through that process. FSBOs for sale by owner at all-time lows at 8%. We have seen this at historic lows for a number of years now. When we look at this data, I think it's fascinating because inventory is tight, but we're not seeing that FSBO number go up because people want to ask someone questions. They want someone to price their home competitively, to find the qualified buyer. But sneaking up on the ranks here of what people want from their seller's agent is to show them how to fix up their home for a sale. That, I think, is really fascinating. Everyone's binge watching a lot of TV, a lot of HGTV, and they're saying, how do I actually figure out what would attract a buyer into my home to get this staged appropriately? 7 in 10 buyers expect that a home is going to look like TV shows, and they're disappointed that homes don't look like TV shows. When we think about how old the housing stock is and how long people are staying in their home, that's just laughable because that really is not realistic right now when we think about how long people have been in their homes. And I'll show you some of that data too. But not to go too far away here. We asked the consumers that we're talking to, how are you communicating with your agent? How is this important in this process right now during COVID? And what we found is there's actually a change up in the communication with agents right now. So phone, number one, not too surprising here, but it's gone quickly up to number 2 is talking via Skype, via FaceTime, via Zoom. People really want those face-to-face interactions, are very much missing out on them. And so text messaging has actually dropped in importance from what we've seen pre-COVID. When you're working with an agent, you actually want that face-to-face communication that perhaps you would have had at a coffee shop and you would have had over the hood of a car as you go and look at the homes. And so now you're taking that communication onto an online platform, and consumers are feeling very comfortable with that, but they also really want that. The other thing that I think is really important right now is that we're seeing that agents matter more during the pandemic than before. And this again speaks to the industry. About half of buyers and sellers are actually saying that they're relying more on their real estate professional when searching for a home in the pandemic than before. These are buyers and sellers who are back in the market. I think this is so important when we look at this because they want that communication. They want to be able to ask the questions. They want someone to say, it's okay. We're going to make sure that the buyers who come through your home have PPE on. We're going to make sure that everyone is safe through that practice. We're going to make sure if you're going to tour through a home that we are strategic on the homes that we target. We put a contract in quickly and we have the best offer on that home. And that all of those types of questions, you can't ask to technology, and you certainly can't ask them in a virtual tour. You really need your agent by there on your side to be able to do these things with you. All right. I think it's incredible how much our members volunteer. So 8 in 10 members volunteer, they donate to their communities, they're invested in their communities. But just looking at the aspect of COVID, we already know that 6 in 10 are donating and they're volunteering. They're doing wellness checks. They're donating to food banks and food delivery services to frontline workers. I think that's incredibly important. We know that members are invested, but to see it happen and to see them really say, you know what, we're going to put our investment and our hours where we can to really help with our community right now that is in need. All right, I'm going to shift gears here quite a bit. September is Realtor Safety Month. There's no easy way to talk about this, but we know that there are a number of members who have been in a situation where they have felt fear for their personal safety. A lot of this has to do in open houses and showings, vacant properties, secluded areas. We do research on this and we have the numbers. What we saw this year is that the share who said that they felt fear for their personal safety actually went down. But what that corresponds with, of course, is that there was a drop in open houses and a drop in listing presentations. So less areas where they could feel fear perhaps. But I want to encourage you guys, because it's Realtor Safety Month, to really do check out, all times of year, but especially during September, is nar.realtor/safety. There's a number of videos and tips that you guys can really bring into your practice. Even turning on your iPhone app to let people know where you are, letting people know where you are when you go to a listing presentation, so you're not meeting someone for the first time in a secluded property. Very, very important. All right, number 5, what is next? What is around the corner? So what we're seeing right now, based on survey data from our members, is that they're feeling prepared. So if there is this continued wave of COVID going into the fall, a second rebound here, what we're seeing is that members are prepared. They've pivoted their businesses. They're feeling like they would be okay going into this. I think that there's opportunities here. We're all in a pressure cooker situation, whether your cats are knocking over your computer while you're trying to present, or whether you have kids at home that you're trying to homeschool, or aging adult relatives. We're all in a situation of immense stress during this time period. And I think that there's an opportunity, though, to help people find the home that'll help them better live their life. We know right now that the tenure in home has increased dramatically. It's at 10 years before people purchase a home from where they have been living in. It used to be 6 to 7 years because something in your life would change. You'd have a new job or a new baby, and we've seen birth rates go down. We've seen marriage rates go down. So those things aren't happening, causing that move to happen. But maybe COVID is that time. You have low interest rates. Let's get folks into homes where they feel like this is where they can be the most productive, the most healthy self, and the most healthy family that they can be at this time. I think there's a lot of changes that could be coming around the corner. I'm going to throw a few of these out. You guys might laugh me, I guess, off the Zoom, not out of the room here, but things that I think we could be seeing. There's a lot of people who are living in tiny condos right now in city centers, probably 600, 500 square feet. And they might be saying, you know what, I just need fresh air. I would be willing to even live in a tiny home on land, have a couple of tiny homes on land with my relatives, and perhaps this is the place for me. I also know we're already seeing in the data that vacation homes that really could be very interesting to consumers right now. A vacation home with good broadband, maybe that's your primary home in the future. Maybe you don't have to go back to that small city center home, and you can embrace a different way of life, especially as commutes are not mattering as much. Also, I think that there could be this reinvention of rural areas, traditionally recreation areas, that have only seen recreation areas, this boom during summer months. Maybe we're going to see this boom year round. And I think that this will be very interesting. I've heard the term Zoom towns being thrown out in the last few days, and I think that that could be something that really comes into play here. As long as there's good broadband access, it really can work from anywhere. Just throw a different background on the back, no one knows where you are. And then the big question mark here is, how do schools come into play? That is a huge question mark for administrators, for teachers, for families right now, and especially as there's virtual learning. Maybe you do live in that school district most of the year, but do you actually have to physically be in that school district most of the year? I don't know. Big question mark there. And I want to leave you with this. We have a program that's called Bright Tools right now. You can get free resources, free classes. At one point, they're switching up the resources on a very frequent basis, so I don't have all of the details of what's up there right now, but the ePro course, you could take it completely for free. You can also, right now, I do know you can download the member profile, the NAR member profile, see how you match up, see how your business matches up. But we also have the profile home buyers and sellers up there for free at one point. So please do check us out. There are a lot of resources for realtors to use. And I'm one of the researchers in the department. There's a lot of researchers doing really cool activity. Right before I jumped on here, we had a team meeting. We had 3 presentations. One of the team members is doing research on ghost kitchens, vacant malls, repurposing them. Fascinating information. Another one has interactive maps on unemployment rate, who's unemployed, how long they have been, the ages, demographics. Fascinating stuff. So please truly do check us out on social media and follow us along on our blog. I really appreciate the time being here, and I think we'll have questions I think after the next one, but I will stop sharing. Okay, thanks.
Wow, Jessica, that was such great information. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. I'm Angele Laborde. I'm the new executive at the Lexington Chamber of Commerce, and happy to be a part of this presentation today. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next presenter, which is Dr. Joseph C. Von Nessen. Dr. Von Nessen is a highly renowned research economist in the Division of Research at the Darla Moore School of Business. Specializing in housing economics and residential real estate, Dr. Von Nessen supplies economic and marketing research to clients in both the private and public sector. This Furman and USC alum is responsible for the preparation and presentation of the annual University of South Carolina's statewide economic forecast and has done research for companies including Boeing, Michelin, Sunoco, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and Savannah River National Lab. Dr. Von Nessen is a speaker for many national conventions, most notably the International Builder Show, the 21st Century Building Expo, and the North American Regional Science Council. Dr. Von Nessen is an active member of the Building Industry Association of South Carolina, BIA of SC, and often works with other members of the BIA, as well as the Association of Realtors throughout South Carolina. Welcome, Dr. Von Nessen.
Well, good morning. Let me take one moment and share my screen here with everyone. There we go. It should be all set. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you again for inviting me to participate with you this morning. It's great to be with you. Always a pleasure, and also to present alongside Jessica this morning. We heard a lot of great information, which actually provides us some very good news for the long-term prospects for South Carolina's economic growth, which I'm going to be talking about in my comments this morning. So we've heard more generally about broader demographic trends and patterns, and I want to talk more specifically about what's happening in South Carolina, because what we do is what I like to call so what economics, which means we're always looking at economic data and asking the question, so what? I use that term half jokingly, but really to make a serious point, because it's important to look at economic data and to use that to help organizations and businesses make strategic decisions. That's what we're all about. And of course, when you're trying to make strategic decisions for a business, obviously understanding the economic landscape is of prime importance, particularly now where we are in 2020. So I want to talk a bit about what's happening in South Carolina and provide a bit more of a local perspective. So just a quick outline in terms of where we're going to be headed over the next few minutes this morning. First, I want to talk specifically about the current state of South Carolina's economy and to a certain extent to what's going on at the national level as well. Then we'll shift gears a little bit and talk about what we expect for the rest of this year and into 2021. And then finally, I'll come back and tie this all into South Carolina housing markets. What do we expect for housing markets, again, for the rest of 2020 and into 2021 as well. So to start out, I think it's important to put some perspective on this current pandemic and on the current recession that it has initiated. And to do that, I think we can compare this current recession, which I like to call the Great Shutdown, and compare it to characteristics of the previous recession that's known as, of course, the Great Recession. Because if we look at them, they're very different recessions and have very different characteristics. Specifically, there are two that we can point to. First of all, this current recession that we've been in has been far more intense than anything that we've seen before, but it's also likely to be far shorter in total duration. Okay, so far more intense, but far more likely to be shorter in total duration compared to previous recessions and the Great Recession from 2008 in particular. So let's look at a couple of data series to illustrate that concept. The first thing that we can look at when just comparing these two recession periods is to look at weekly initial unemployment insurance claims. And this is a good gauge for the number of newly unemployed people in any given week. It's a real-time metric because it comes out on a weekly basis. And again, it gives us a sense of how many people are being laid off. And if we just compare the red line there, which is the current recession, to the Great Recession in blue, you can see that the spike in weekly claims just completely dwarfs anything that we saw in 2008, the spike that we saw in 2020. So your y-axis there represents the additional initial unemployment insurance claims above and beyond the number that we saw before the recession began. So in 2020, we peaked at around 64,000 claims beyond what we were seeing as of February of 2020. And again, just completely dwarfs anything that we saw back in 2008. However, if we also look at the duration, you also see a very different story from what appeared in 2008. So if we look at that blue line, you can see that we didn't begin to approach the pre-recession levels of layoff activity or initial claims until about 80 weeks following the 2008 crisis, or about a year and a half. In contrast, look how quickly initial claims have come back down in just about 3 months, or 4 months now, following the initial shutdown back in the spring. So very different in terms of overall duration so far and what we might expect going forward. So again, two major differences, far more intense, but likely to be shorter in duration compared to what we saw back in 2008. Now, another way that we can see the clear intensity of this recession is just to look at GDP growth as a whole. This tracks it back to 2007 and just gives us a sense of what the US economy has been doing, what its performance level has been. This is the single best metric that we have for the health of the national economy. And once again, you can see the staggering negative level or negative growth activity in the second quarter of 2020, down 31.7%, which was by far the worst quarter of GDP growth on record. So again, that just illustrating another way to see this level of intensity of this current recession because of that explicit shutdown that was experienced back in the spring. However, it's also important to recognize what was happening before 2020. So if we look over the past several years, what you'll notice is very steady positive GDP growth for the United States that approximated between 2 and 3%, depending on the quarter that we're looking at. And that's also very important too, because I'm going to come back and talk more about this, but as we moved into 2020, right before the pandemic began in the United States in February, the US economy was actually in very good shape. By most economic metrics, we were moving in a positive direction, and there were no real structural problems with the economy, as there often are, that drive or enable a recession to occur. That wasn't the case this time. This was the first time that we saw a shutdown, an external factor, separate and apart from normal economic sectors or economic metrics, that was driving that recession, the cause of the recession. So it was something coming in from outside of the economy. The economy was otherwise healthy. And that's going to help us as we begin to recover, once again, because the fundamentals were already in pretty solid place going into 2020. Now, we can talk about what's happening in South Carolina as well. We want to focus more on what's been happening in our state. And one way to see that is first to break down the changes in employment activity that has been experienced in 2020 by industry. So this graph illustrates the major super sectors in South Carolina, the major industry super sectors. And I'm not going to go through each one of these individually, but I want you to just get a sense of the change in employment activity that we saw in the spring of this year when comparing that explicitly to the spring of 2019. So for example, if you look at the red bars here, this shows for each industry the change in employment growth between April of 2020 and April of 2019. And very clearly, no industry was spared. We saw negative growth across the board. The three industries hit hardest in South Carolina were leisure and hospitality. That was number one. Manufacturing was number two. And actually healthcare related services was number three. A lot of people forget that non-emergency and non-mandatory healthcare services, those that could be put off, such as non-emergency surgeries, things like dental care, physical therapy, things that are important but can be delayed, that require a lot of in-person interaction, those were postponed. And so that's why healthcare was also at the top of the list in terms of industries affected. Now, notice also, in addition to the negative growth in April, comparing April of 2019 to April of 2020, we've seen a sizable improvement in the months since then. So blue here represents the changes in employment between July of 2020 and July of 2019. Now, across the board, again, the recovery has been different, and most industries are still down in total in terms of their employment activity, but we're still moving in the right direction. And using leisure and hospitality here as an example, you'll notice that it went from being down 50%, 50% between April of 2019 to April of 2020. It's now down just 20% as of July. Again, still very negative numbers, but we've clearly pivoted and changed direction and are moving in a pattern of recovery now, and in a positive direction overall. We can also look at employment patterns in South Carolina, not just by industry. We can also look at what's happening at the county level. And this graph points us to unemployment rates by county. So the unemployment rate in South Carolina as a whole is 8.6% right now. And you can see the varying unemployment rates across the state. The area that was hit hardest in the midst of the shutdown back in the spring was the Myrtle Beach area. Again, because leisure and hospitality was hardest hit. And Horry County itself actually had an unemployment rate over 22% back in April. So just to, again, put that in perspective. And Myrtle Beach, still the area that is seeing the lowest rates of recovery so far in terms of looking at the aggregate unemployment rate. So it still has the highest unemployment rates as a whole when we look by county across South Carolina. Notice also that while most of the state is recovering, one of the other things that I want to point out here is that if we look at the Midlands region and look at Columbia, as we see recovery, I think we have to be careful looking into 2021 because the industry composition across the state is going to greatly affect the pace of recovery that we are likely to see. So early on, what you find in South Carolina is that the hardest hit regions were the coastal area of South Carolina because of leisure and hospitality, and the upstate, Greenville-Spartanburg, because they were more concentrated in manufacturing. The Midlands was somewhat spared. But going forward, we also have to be cautious because the Midlands has a higher percentage of its economy that is nested within the public sector, or that is comprised of the public sector. And what we're seeing now, of course, is the fact that the contraction is leading to fewer tax dollars coming in and is leading to budget cuts in the public sector. So I think that suggests that going forward into 2021, it may be the case that Columbia, the Midlands region, tends to recover more slowly relative to other major markets in South Carolina, such as Charleston and Greenville-Spartanburg. Again, that's something to be aware of just because of the unique composition of the Midlands economy relative to other areas as we move forward. One other area that we can look at, or one other statistic that we can track when gauging unemployment overall, is just to look at unemployment rates at the national level as well, and to track them over time, not just look at them at a single point in time. So again, 8.6% unemployment for South Carolina. You can see that we're at 8.4% unemployment for the US. We don't actually have August unemployment data for South Carolina yet. That will be coming out next week. And we do anticipate that unemployment will continue to tick down in South Carolina. So we anticipate an unemployment rate slightly below 8.6% when that comes out next week. And once again, you can track the unemployment rate progression from February through August now in South Carolina at the US level. And notice that we have come a long way. Again, if we look at unemployment, 12.8% back in April, down to 8.6% now. We've seen similar trends at the national level. So while these numbers aren't good in and of themselves, the absolute numbers aren't good, the trend is very positive. So we've seen a clear directional shift between March and April and really into May, and seen a very steady decline of unemployment overall since then. So negative numbers overall, but very positive in terms of the trend line that we have established. Now, what does this actually mean in terms of recovery? When we talk about a V-shaped recovery pattern, what does that actually mean in terms of the pace of recovery? How can we quantify that? Well, one way to do that is just to look at the sheer percentage of jobs that we've recovered in South Carolina. Just explicitly compare those. And when we do that, it turns out that the numbers are looking, once again, pretty positive so far. We've recovered about 54% of the jobs that we lost between March and April. Just doing a straight comparison, job losses between March and April of 2020 in South Carolina, and job gains in the following 3 months between April and July of 2020. Again, we've recovered about 54% of those jobs overall, and we've done better than the national average, which has been, as you can see here, 45%, which is what the US has recovered as a whole. And to really put that into perspective, again, comparing where we are today with where we were back in 2008, in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession, it took us 5 years, 5 full years to recover 100% of the jobs that we lost. Okay, 5 full years to recover 100% of the jobs we lost. Compare that to about 50%, 54% of the jobs we lost, roughly half, in the span of 3 months. Again, going back to this theme of the fact that this recession has been far more intense, but is likely to be shorter in total duration. So that's important to think through as we move forward. And it also points to the evidence that we have seen a V-shaped recovery in the early months of this recovery. When economists talk about a V-shape, a sharp downturn followed by a sharp recovery, this is one way that we can actually observe that. And we're clearly seeing that in South Carolina and have through the early part of the summer months. But what do we expect going forward into the rest of 2020 and into 2021? So I want to shift gears just a little bit. We've talked about what's been happening, what the recovery has looked like through midsummer, but we also want to look at what we can expect going forward for the rest of this year and into 2021. So I want to change gears a little bit and look ahead. And the first thing I think we need to recognize is that the pace of recovery has actually slowed. So we were in this V-shaped recovery pattern during the early part of the summer, but that has morphed into more of a U-shaped recovery pattern, what economists call a U-shape, more of a slow and steady recovery as opposed to a quick jump following a sharp decline. And this graph here illustrates that process and helps us to visualize what that looks like. So the red, of course, is the downturn that we saw back in March and early April. We see the V-shaped recovery, recovering approximately half of the jobs that we lost in green there. We're approximately at that yellow star right now. And the path has changed though. So rather than being on that green line, we're on that blue dotted line. So we're still recovering, but not quite at the pace of recovery that we were seeing during the early part of the summer. Now, when we look at this, two questions emerge as to this graph. The first question is this true? What is the evidence that suggests that this is true? And secondly, is it likely to continue? Or are we likely to see a faster growth pattern later this year, or perhaps an even slower growth pattern? How do we begin to think about both of those two questions? Well, first of all, let's examine the evidence and show how we know that we actually have shifted more from a V-shaped to a U-shaped recovery pattern. And the first way to do that, there are two pieces of evidence that I want to share with you. The first is to look at unemployment insurance claims data again. So these are the initial claims. Remember that these reflect the number of newly laid off people on a week-to-week basis. And once again, this is what we looked at before. So you can see the peak in early April and then the sizable and very fast drop-off since then. And in fact, unemployment insurance claims now, initial claims, are getting back close to the level that they were at back in February. And what this graph shows us is stability. It shows us that our economy has stabilized, that most of the employers who had to lay workers off because of COVID have already laid workers off. So most of that decline in unemployment activity has already occurred, and we are stabilizing. Again, great news, and that's a great first step for the recovery process. But in addition to initial claims, we can also look at continued unemployment insurance claims. So I want you to focus on the left chart here for just a moment for continued claims. And this is a better representation of the total number of unemployed people in South Carolina, because this looks at all people filing an unemployment insurance claim on a week-to-week basis, not just the newly unemployed people. And so like the initial claims graph that we just looked at, you see a huge spike in April, but then it tapers off very, very quickly, and we see a sharp decline. But back when we move into the July period, it essentially levels off somewhat. So it's still going down, but not at the rate that it was going down initially, right? So it jumps up, it jumps down, and then levels out a bit. So what does that suggest? It suggests that people have been going back to work, that we're seeing the economy recover, but we're not seeing people come off of those unemployment insurance, coming off of unemployment insurance benefits as quickly as we were seeing during the early part of the summer months, suggesting that the recovery is slowing down a bit. Now, you might ask, well, what about that huge downturn in August, right? So on kind of the right side of that black line there. And that's a bit misleading, because what's also happening is that in South Carolina, individuals who file for unemployment can qualify for 20 weeks worth of South Carolina benefits. And right now, because of the pandemic, through the CARES Act, people, when they roll off of those 20 weeks, can move on to pandemic emergency unemployment compensation, PEUC claims, which is what you're seeing on the right side of your screen there. And they can qualify for an additional 13 weeks. And so what started happening in August was that the people who were initially laid off in late March and early April, they're now getting to the end of that 20-week period. And so those people who are still unemployed are now moving off of state benefits under continued claims and moving on to those PEUC claims data. So that's why you see a sizable uptick in PEUC claims at the same time as you see a very quick downturn in the continued claims. Now, when we net all this out, the bottom line here is that we're still seeing more people going back to work. We're still seeing the number of claimants, unemployment insurance claimants, going down, which is very positive. But again, just not at the rate that we were seeing during the early part of the summer, which is why we are moving more towards a V-shaped to a U-shaped recovery pattern. The second way that we can see this, the second piece of evidence, is just to look at the self-reported worker reports on who is being temporary versus who is being permanently laid off. So workers, when they file for unemployment, they often have return to work dates provided by their employer. And back during the early part of the recovery, back in March, April, and May, we found that more than 80% of people who were laid off in South Carolina were provided a return to work date by their employer, meaning that most of the workers who had been laid off were given a return to work date, so they were likely to go back to work relatively quickly, and many of those workers did. But in the months since then, that number has dropped, and it's now well below 50%, meaning that fewer than half of the workers still unemployed have a specific job to return to that they had previously lost. What does that mean? It means that they're going to have to spend more time, of course, looking for work, finding a new position, and that time spent looking for work is going to slow down the pace of the recovery. So we're seeing a greater percentage now of the people who are still unemployed reporting basically being permanently unemployed from their previous position as opposed to temporarily from back in the spring. And again, all that does is means that it's going to take a bit longer for them to get back to work, which slows the pace of recovery overall. And that's what we're seeing right now. So this begs the question then, why? Why is this happening? Why would we be shifting from a V-shaped to a U-shaped recovery pattern? Well, there are three primary reasons that I want to briefly go through with you. The first is what everybody expects and everybody has heard about, which is the spike in COVID cases that we saw in South Carolina and elsewhere back in July. Now, you might recall that that spike in cases led to additional action on the part of Governor McMaster and his staff, because when we see an increase in cases, that causes more concern amongst the public. People tend to pull back their level of activity overall. Businesses have to respond, and policymakers respond as well. And you may remember that July 11th was actually the date that Governor McMaster announced the ban on alcohol sales after 11 p.m. Most of us remember when he did that, and that was on July 11th as part of his direct response to the spike in cases in early July. So we see the spike in cases having effects across all areas of the local economy, again, slowing down activity as a whole. A second reason why we've seen this shift in recent months since July is because we've begun to see more PPP fund exhaustion as well, what I call PPP fund exhaustion. And so what this means is that if we look at the companies that applied for and received PPP loans through the CARES Act, remember that the reason for that was for those businesses those dollars were allocated to those businesses to be able to sustain themselves during a very difficult period of time when there was very low demand. And specifically, the Payroll Protection Program was designed to preserve payroll, to keep people employed when market demand was down. And so companies during March, April, and May were applying for those funds, they were receiving them, and they've been using those funds. And what's been happening since July is the first companies that applied for and received those funds are now beginning to use up the funds that they were allocated. And so now they're having to shift back towards relying primarily on market demand. And in some cases, they're able to do that very successfully. In some cases, not so much, in which case they're seeing a decline in activity. And in some cases, they may be having to lay workers off that up until now, they had been able to avoid doing. So the spike in cases was a major reason why we saw that change in pace of the recovery. But the PPP fund exhaustion is a second reason as well that I don't think gets quite as much attention. And then the third reason is that there's simply an upper limit on some business activity in the short run. Because when we think about COVID and we think about the problems, especially for businesses that rely on these in-person interactions, social distancing, that creates practical problems, particularly for restaurants. That's the classic example. And so when, let's say, your dining room is only able to seat at 50% or 60% or 70% capacity, that puts limits on what you can do. And so that is contributing to the limit on the pace of recovery. Now, businesses, of course, adapt over time. And Jessica actually mentioned before how we're seeing adaptions on the part of businesses and individuals as we navigate this new normal, and businesses are constantly evolving. So while there are upper limits in the short run, I do want to underline short run, that businesses adapt, and they are getting better at engaging with new processes. So as we move forward, this will be less of a concern, but this has been one reason for the change in pace during the summer months. Now, what do we expect for the fall? Specifically, what do we need to be on the lookout for in terms of whether or not the U-shaped recovery pattern will stay the same, get better, or get worse? Well, first of all, I think it's unlikely that the pace will slow further. I think, again, getting back to this idea that the public and businesses are adapting, that's going to continue to take hold as we move ahead. Remember that when this came on us back in the spring, this was a complete surprise, and businesses especially were not prepared at all for this. And so it really threw a wrench into everyone's plans, not just the shutdown, but even in the recovery period when businesses could reopen, but they had all of these additional restrictions. But now they have had time to adapt, they have had time to prepare, and they're beginning to prepare for the possibility of a second wave or an uptick. And so that means that any additional spike in cases is likely to have a lower negative effect than we saw the first time around. So that's point one, and that's very important to recognize. But in terms of whether the U-shaped recovery gains additional steam in the fall, it's going to depend largely on these three factors, which I call September scenarios, things that we need to be thinking about. The first is the effects of school scheduling and reopening. We already heard Jessica mentioned a little bit about that. But as she mentioned, everybody is affected by school schedules, right? So it's not just parents and teachers, but pretty much everyone is affected. Certainly businesses are affected because their employees, many of whom are parents, are impacted by the scheduling. And so as we establish this new normal, that creates disruptions. And also it may or may not lead to an additional spike in COVID cases in September, comparable to what we saw back in July. We don't know what that's going to look like yet. And I'm not just talking about the university level, I'm also talking about K through 12. So again, every region is different, so we'll see how that plays out. But I think that once we get past September and we begin to establish a new normal with respect to school schedules, that will smooth out some of the uncertainty and help as we move later into the fall. But we have to get through this initial period of establishing a new normal relative to school scheduling and school processes. Secondly, will we see any additional unemployment insurance benefits that are implemented in South Carolina? So you may recall that President Trump provided an executive order a few weeks ago directing the states to apply, if they wanted to, for the ability to provide $300 in federal supplemental unemployment insurance that would replace the $600 federal unemployment supplement that expired at the end of July. Now, South Carolina applied for and was accepted into that program. No funds have come into South Carolina just yet, but when that happens, that will also provide a positive effect in terms of introducing additional spending activity to the South Carolina economy. So that's going to move us in a positive direction as well. And then finally, what do we have to look forward to with respect to additional stimulus activity? One of the things that you'll see is that most economists, as well as the Federal Reserve, essentially all agree that the U.S. economy does need some additional stimulus as we continue to navigate the recovery process. The question, of course, is what is the most appropriate level of stimulus and what type of programs should be engaged in? That, of course, is a political question that they're currently navigating. But we may get another stimulus package at some point this fall, which, of course, would potentially lead to an uptick in the pace of recovery as well. So three major factors to be considering as we look to whether or not the pace of recovery that we're seeing now, the slow and steady recovery pattern, will improve over time. And the three things that we just mentioned why is that going to help? Well, if we look at the primary driver behind this recovery, it's consumer spending, which is largely driven by consumer sentiment. And so far, we've seen some steady recovery in this area. So just briefly, I'll share with you some consumer sentiment data. You can see how the patterns have changed, consumer confidence overall. So a significant downturn there back in the spring, again, as we would expect, but it is recovering somewhat. We're currently at about 2014 levels when we think about consumer confidence as a whole. But as with the unemployment data, it's not the number itself that's important right now when we're analyzing these trends. It's more, what is the trend? What is the direction? And the direction has moved positive in the last couple of months, which has been a good thing for the US economy. Because this, of course, also drives consumer spending, which is about 70% of GDP. About 70% of our total economy is driven by personal consumption expenditures, is driven by consumer spending. So this, another critical element to be watching. And as you can see, a major downturn again in the spring, followed by a pretty sizable and robust recovery so far. Now, growth is still negative, but keep in mind, this is looking at year-over-year growth, right? So we're comparing where we are today versus where we are 1 year ago. So personal consumption expenditures are still down relative to a year ago, but down far less so than they were back in the April and May time period. So again, we're moving in the right direction for many of these trends. Okay, so let's shift gears then one more time, and let's now move and talk more about what's happening with housing markets. We've talked in general about the US and South Carolina economies in terms of what's been happening up until the late summer months. We've talked a bit about what we expect for the rest of 2020, and now I want to turn and talk about what this implies for housing markets, and specifically, what can we say about housing in light of these broader economic trends in terms of how we move forward in 2020 and into 2021. And of course, as economists, we always talk about supply and demand. So these are the two factors that I want to drill down on in terms of examining housing. And the short answer here, when we think about supply and demand factors, demand is still fairly strong, and we're fairly optimistic that that will continue for the rest of this year. So the bigger concerns are going to be on the supply side. And Jessica's talked a little bit about this, but I want to talk more specifically about some different ways to break down a couple of these measurements that haven't been discussed just yet. So let's talk about demand first, and then we'll come back and revisit the supply side. So first of all, again, just to reiterate, demand for housing has been doing very, very well. There was a clear downturn back in the March and April time frame, which has very quickly rebounded. And we can see that in the data. We can see that both if we look at new single-family home sales. Again, there are multiple ways to view this. These are just a few examples. But new sales, we see the downturn followed by the recovery with levels of sales activity still at all-time highs, at least over the last several years. And we get a very similar pattern if we look at existing homes, home sales as well. So once again, a downturn in the March, April, and into May period for existing single-family home sales, but then a nice bounce back and recovery beginning in July. So we have seen a very clear recovery, and housing is continuing to do very well. And once again, the question then becomes why? And we have to understand why to get a feel for whether or not these trends are going to last. And so there are three specific answers to this question in terms of why we're seeing a rebound in housing that I want to go through with you. The first bullet point here is driven by the very basic demand drivers of housing overall. And one of the things that we always talk about is how the biggest single predictor for housing demand is employment growth. That's really the magic number to look at, or the magic trend, employment growth. Those are the figures that we need to focus on if we're just looking at one. Low interest rates, of course, is a second one because that impacts the price of housing. And so this first bullet point just really illustrates the primary demand-driven factors. And as Jessica has pointed out before, both of these are doing fairly well right now in terms of being able to propel demand. But one area that we haven't talked too much about is that the recovery in terms of employment growth is very much divided into different segments. And if we look at employment growth overall, we can categorize it in different ways. But basically what we've seen is that if you break down the occupations in South Carolina and in the US into two categories, higher wage, higher skilled positions, and lower wage, lower skilled positions, you get a very different perspective on the pace of recovery. And when we divide it up into these two categories, the real key dividing line between these two categories when we're looking at a given job is, does that job require any education beyond high school? If the answer is yes, then the recovery is progressing fairly well, again, overall. If the answer is no, it's proceeding less well. And again, these are averages, so any individual perspective may vary, of course. But in general, those are the two buckets that we can look at and that we can classify. And one way to see that is if we just look at the employment growth trends year to date in 2020 and just compare what they look like when we look at these relatively higher wage, higher skilled positions versus lower wage, lower skilled positions. And you see a very big difference here. Growth of over 3% year to date versus a loss of about 9% year to date. So that's a very big difference, a very big gap there between the two. And what I would suggest to you is that as you're looking at different markets and different industries, and housing in particular, think about the customer base. And I would suggest that in housing, many home buyers fit into the former rather than the latter, into the higher wage, high skill position, as opposed to the lower wage, lower skill positions. And so that's where this demand is coming from. So that's why we're seeing fairly stronger demand among housing overall and single family housing in particular, while we're seeing less recovery either in the rental space or to some extent in terms of first-time home buyers. But by and large, when we look at the housing industry and home buyers, those occupations, those jobs, those customers fit into this one category that is seeing more recovery. And that's why we're seeing very strong housing demand, even though we have a very high unemployment rate overall right now, both in South Carolina and at the national level. One other way that we can see this breakdown, just to illustrate what this looks like, is if we look at South Carolina job losses by industry. You can see the breakdown here. I'm not going to go through every industry, but just focus on that box on the bottom right of your screen that about 77% of the jobs lost paid at or below the state average. So once again, emphasizing this point that it really depends on your customer and what their occupations look like, what industry they're in terms of whether or not they're going to be preserving the demand that they had before the pandemic began. It really varies greatly based on industry and on occupation. And then finally, one other way that we can see this is if we look at average hourly earnings for the US as a whole. A very clear change in the trend that is exactly the opposite of what you might first expect. So if we look at average hourly earnings over the last several years, this goes back to January of 2017, you can see that average hourly earnings has basically had a very steady increase over time, not much deviation in it at all, with the exception of the spring of 2020. So a huge jump and then a huge drop off back to close to where we were. So it's almost an inverse V, right? And you look at that and you say, well, that seems wrong. That seems exactly the opposite of what we might expect. But what's happening here is because this recession has disproportionately affected lower wage workers, when those workers are laid off, they're no longer counted in this data series, in the average hourly earnings data series. And so when you don't count a lot of lower wage workers, when you're averaging it out, what does that do to the average? It bumps it up. And so as a result, we see this huge increase over a very short period of time. And then it comes back down as those workers begin to be rehired. So this blip in average hourly earnings, again, another representation of how the recession has disproportionately affected lower income and lower wage workers. And that makes a difference to industry. So it's very important to focus on who's been affected and how does that affect your customer base when thinking about demand overall. Now, one other area that we can look at when thinking about these ultimate drivers of demand. Remember, we talked about employment growth and we talked about low interest rates. I want to come back to low interest rates for a moment, because this has been, as Jessica mentioned, really driving additional buyers, driving additional demand overall. But why do we have low interest rates? Well, number one, of course, it's because the Fed is looking to stimulate the economy right now, keeping interest rates low, stimulating home buyers, and of course, spending in other areas, in other sectors of the economy as well. But this is likely to last for a considerable period of time. And this is another important point that I think we need to recognize. So very recently, Jay Powell, pictured here, he's the chair of the Federal Reserve, basically gave a speech called the U.S. Central Bank Policy Framework Review, and outlined a strategy where he said that because the economy is struggling significantly right now, he's looking for strategies to help boost long-run economic growth over time in the long run. And he wants to do that because, again, if we look at measures of growth over the last decade, particularly inflation has been historically low. So the Federal Reserve typically targets the US economy to have an overall inflation rate of 2%. That's their goal, 2%, which is illustrated here in this graph. That black line you can see is right at the 2% mark. And notice that inflation over the last decade has at times exceeded 2%, but very, very rarely. And so this is a sign that the economy hasn't been doing as well as it potentially could do. Because when economic growth is stronger, typically we see higher rates of overall inflation. So inflation is one measure of how fast the economy is growing at any given period. And so what Jay Powell has said is that the Fed is looking to increase the target inflation rate above 2% in order to help boost long-run economic growth. And so how do they do that? Well, one way to do that, one way to boost growth and to try to get inflation a bit higher is to keep interest rates low for a longer period of time. And that's what he's committed to doing, either explicitly or implicitly through the speech in terms of changing the goals of the Fed long term. Now, he's explicitly stated that interest rates are likely to not go up before the end of 2021. His speech suggests that they may stay low for even longer. So the bottom line for the housing market is that if we're looking at a question of how long will interest rates stay low, the answer is likely for the foreseeable future. So interest rates are going to be a very positive driver for housing demand going forward, certainly through the recovery period as from the pandemic, but possibly even beyond that as well. The other positive implication for this change in Fed policy is that it's going to keep the dollar relatively more depreciated. And you can see the foreign exchange rate here. This is with the euro. This is just one example. But why is it important? Why is it beneficial to South Carolina for the dollar to be more depreciated? And the answer is that all the goods that are manufactured in South Carolina that are sold overseas are now cheaper from the perspective of the foreign buyer. So this actually boosts demand among foreign consumers for US manufactured goods and for South Carolina manufactured goods. And given that advanced manufacturing has been the single biggest driver of our economic expansion over the previous decade in South Carolina, this has good implications for our state as well as we move into recovery mode for the rest of 2020 and into 2021. So Fed policy, very important for South Carolina moving forward. Okay, so those are the basic demand factors for why we're seeing the rebound in housing now. A couple of other factors, just briefly, I'll mention. Two new lifestyle demands that we are seeing emerge that are unique in 2020 following COVID. I'll just quickly reiterate these because Jessica did a great job going into detail on both of these. But basically, we're seeing migration patterns where people are relocating away from major cities. So think about New York and San Francisco. People are looking to move towards less crowded areas with a lower cost of living, higher natural amenities, and where there's some suburban sprawl where they can get more space and get away from those crowded areas. And when you think about that descriptively and you say, well, which markets does that describe? I would argue South Carolina. Many markets in South Carolina is a perfect description. So these migration patterns that are emerging, people moving away from major cities, is poised to directly benefit South Carolina and is already doing so in some markets that we're hearing about anecdotally. So people are moving into the state, and that's creating additional demand on top of what we've seen, as I mentioned in bullet point 1 here. And then secondly, as Jessica mentioned, a reassessment of housing needs. Just because people are working from home, they need home offices, they may need to stay home with their children. So for a variety of reasons, the housing needs that we've seen in the last several years are changing, and that's going to put upward pressure on demand as well. And then finally, point number 3, low inventory levels. This is geared more towards a change in pricing as opposed to demand. Of course, keeping upward pressure on pricing overall, that's likely to continue as well. And if we look at the FHFA House Price Index, this is not a measure of just looking at increases in the sales price of homes over time. This looks at the difference in, or looks at house price appreciation. So how much is the same house worth over time? So a slightly different measure, but we can see it's been very stable even through the second quarter of 2020. Again, very positive news for the housing market because we want to see slow and steady house price appreciation. So a given house changing value in a positive direction. That's what this is measuring. So it's looking at the same house over time, the same house being sold over and over again. That's what it's measuring, as opposed to when we just look at house prices increasing, that's just capturing all the houses that sold, let's say in August versus all the houses that sold in July and comparing those two. Again, you see how house prices go up, but those aren't comparing the same houses over time like the FHFA is. So slightly different measures there, both of which though are important to capture. Okay, just briefly, let's talk a bit more about the supply factors. So demand still looking fairly strong headed into the remainder of 2020. Two brief factors I want to share with you on the supply side. The first is if we look at the producer price index, and more generally, if we look at prices for materials and supplies for builders, these are going up and have been going up fairly significantly this year, particularly if we look at softwood lumber and lumber products more generally. This is not exclusively new to 2020, but we've seen a major spike for several reasons, one of which is the fact that we've seen disruption to supply chains, again, not just for lumber products, but for others as well. But you can see about a 22% increase in wood products just in 2020 alone. So on the supply side, again, building materials, the price going up, we've observed that already, and this is likely to continue at least for the short run. These trends don't show any signs of changing. So this is one area of concern, I think, on the supply side that we need to keep in mind, and builders especially. And then the second one that I want to spend just a moment talking about is the potential for lending restrictions. So this big question that's looming is, are we going to see more lending restrictions on the horizon? Because right now, where we are today in September of 2020, we haven't seen banks or financial institutions really have any problem or really been squeezed in terms of financing yet. And the reason for that is because of federal stimulus right now, because of money from the CARES Act, among other policies. Basically, financial institutions are still fairly flush with cash. Also, consumers have, because they've seen stimulus money themselves, have been able to continue to pay down their debts. And so as a result, again, financial institutions haven't seen any squeeze at all. But as we move forward, that may change. And if it does, if banks do become more concerned about their financial capital and their financial resources, they may change their lending restrictions a bit, and that will affect anyone who's looking to get a loan, builders included, of course. So this is something that we need to keep a close eye on in the coming months. How is that going to be affected? How are banks and financial institutions going to be affected? Which is another reason why it's important to keep our eye on what the next wave of stimulus will look like coming from the federal government. So two elements on the supply side here where I think we need to be a bit more cautious. And overall, I think we need to be a bit more cautious on the supply side right now than the demand side when looking at housing markets as a whole. So just a quick comment to conclude. I want to say that 2020 clearly been a rough year for everyone, but I want to reiterate just the idea that South Carolina really does have a bright future. I'm very bullish on our state in the long run over the next, and by long run I mean 2, 3, 5 years out as we get past the pandemic. Hopefully we'll get past it sooner rather than later. But regardless, South Carolina does have a bright future. We are very competitive, have a number of competitive advantages that have been driving our growth over the last decade. By most major metrics, we have exceeded national averages, and we are poised to do the same in the 2020s. All the competitive advantages that we had are not going away. And in fact, the pandemic is to some extent actually increasing some of the competitive advantages, as I mentioned before, because the migration patterns that we're now seeing have the potential to really benefit us here in South Carolina. So bottom line is South Carolina has a bright future, and I'm very bullish as we move forward, despite the fact that 2020 clearly has been a rough year for everyone. So what is our bottom line? Just to reiterate, the current pace of the recovery, as we know, has slowed from a V-shaped to a more U-shaped recovery pattern. And the September scenarios that we outline are going to greatly influence whether we see an increase in the pace of recovery beyond where we are right now, beyond this U-shape or not, or whether we continue at our current pace. We don't expect unemployment to return to pre-COVID levels this year. The recovery will likely continue into 2021. Of course, if we do see a vaccine that is implemented this year, that could change the ball game. So that, of course, is a wild card here. But in the absence of that, we're looking at 2021, at least for a full recovery. So full employment not expected to return in 2020. Again, if we look at housing markets, demand, we expect to remain strong. A couple of concerns on the supply side, but demand is looking good right now for housing markets, certainly in South Carolina. And as I mentioned, we're very well positioned for a post-pandemic world. We have a lot of competitive advantages, a lot of good things happening in South Carolina. And these migration patterns that we're seeing, the work from home phenomenon, all of that has the potential to really benefit our state as well. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'll turn it back over, I think, to Taylor now. I think we're going to go into some Q&A, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate Dr. Lotz and Dr. Von Nessen being on here and presenting today. We had a few questions come up, but I'm going to start with, we have two members. First, Kathy Garrett from Berkshire Hathaway Home Services Midlands Real Estate, who is the president of CCRA, and Angela Klosterman from First Citizens Bank, who is the chair of the Lexington Chamber of Commerce. Kathy, I was just going to start with you real quick. What was kind of your, briefly, what was kind of your takeaway from today's presentation?
It seems that here in the Midlands, we fit both scenarios pretty much to a T. The low supply, the great demand, things are improving. I was really happy to hear Dr. Von Nessen's projections that we should enjoy this for the next couple of years. Because the one question we get a lot as realtors is, because people remember 2008, and a lot of what was happening now with a big boom, people can't help but go back to 2008. And I've always said that, it's a totally different situation and so forth, but it's a very good feeling to hear experts on the subject say basically the same thing, that this is a totally different scenario, and that, there shouldn't be a great panic because we're doing so well, and expect a major decline.
Yeah. Then Angela, from a banking perspective, what was kind of your takeaway?
Well, we're right on trend with everything that Dr. Lotz was saying. We are seeing an increase in second homes and vacation homes due to the low interest rate environment that we're in. And we are too hearing that those will stay low for the foreseeable future. Hopefully the next year, but possibly the next 2 years, we'll continue to see that low rate environment. With that, we're also seeing an increase in home equity lines of credit, both for people who are looking to purchase a new home, using the current equity in their home in order to pull it out so that they're ready to move whenever because the supply is so low, they're ready to move whenever that, to put that contract in. And then also you know, people sitting at home and wanting to change things, needing to put a home office in and stuff, we're seeing an increase in home equity lines of that. And then also in refinances and purchases. So we are right on trend with everything that they were saying. So, I mean, great presentation today. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and give some input.
Thanks. And kind of what Kathy brought up, we had a question about, and Dr. Von Nessen, this may be more geared towards you, you know, kind of along the lines of a housing crisis. I mean, do you see this as kind of a bubble, housing wise? Do you think that this possibly could be, you know, just a peak, and I mean, there could be some concerns about a big drop off based on kind of the you were talking about, the supply issues and things like that. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that demand, as long as unemployment continues to move down, we're going to continue to move in a. I think demand for housing will stay fairly steady. Again, looking at that underlying, you know, when you take away all of the, you know, there are a lot of variables to look at, but if you're looking at one, again, that employment activity is number one. And so as employment growth continues to improve and we see the unemployment rate drop, that's going to be a good sign. But yes, I think getting back to the banking side, the real concern that I think right now is whether or not lending restrictions tighten or not. What is that going to look like? And we really don't know yet because of the stimulus money that's supporting that somewhat right now. So what does that look like over the next 6 months and beyond? That could change things somewhat. But in general, for demand, I think that's going to remain fairly strong.
Okay. Dr. Lotz, how about you? Do you agree with Dr. Von Nessen on that?
I do. The employment is a huge factor, and Joey really touched on the recovery of jobs. And there's been a lot of talk of late among the economist community, at least, about this K-shaped recovery. So those who are recovering quite well, and then those who are really still struggling as their businesses, through no fault of their own, are closed. They can't go back to work. That becomes a very difficult situation. I also think there's an opportunity, as there is so much doubling up among those who are 18 to 29. No one's going to be happy in that situation long term, whether that is the parent or the adult child. And so I think that could be the opportunity to save for that down payment. And that gives the opportunity that you're not having to match a lease term to how you find a house. It gives you more flexibility to get into the market and have a home that comes up that's in your price range, and actually bid on a few homes probably in that price range before you can lock in that contract. So I think that those types of opportunities will be there with that pent-up demand. Coming out of this recovery very quickly, we saw essentially like a spring. You spring right back up and you had this pent-up demand. But I think that there's been pent-up demand for years as we've had a low inventory situation. So it's not just a temporary spring market. This really is a continuation.
Joey, I think Earl had a question about your slide on lumber prices. Earl, you want to ask your question?
Well, I just want to, as much, I guess, reemphasize that is a headwind we see in that lumber prices have increased about 130% since April of this year. So overall, that's an average increase about $16,000 per house. So it is a concern, and we just want to make sure everybody's aware of that. And if you have an opportunity to talk to President Trump or our state senators, Graham and Scott, and any member of Congress, please share that concern with them, because we need some help.
We had a question about the impact on housing with payroll tax deferral. I guess that was for either of you. Do either of you have a comment on that?
I can make a general comment on that. I think the impact overall of that overall is going to be fairly small, at least for now, simply because a deferral means that the money is still owed. So it's one thing if it's forgiven or the tax goes away. It's another thing if it's deferred for a short period of time, which people are still having to plan on paying down the road. So I think the overall effect there is going to be fairly small.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that. Now, this could be an opportunity for people to tap that use that for improvements in their home, put that back into the economy. But again, yes, it's a deferral. If you're taking that, you probably need to be aware that you're going to have to pay that back in April. That being said, from my knowledge, at least, there's a lot of workplaces that are not necessarily offering that because they are aware that their employees would have to pay that back. So I believe at least it's an optional for employers to make that decision.
Okay. Then Jessica, somebody asked what impact the election will have on the housing industry. What's your opinion on that?
I think that my internet just went out. I don't know. I think I lost my connection. Yeah, oh boy. I don't know that I have a good answer to that. I will say that I live in the DC area. We always see, at least in the DC area, when there's a change in administration, you're going to have some home sales, you're going to have some home purchases, even with Congress switching terms. So, I'm not sure what it's going to look like moving forward. I have no crystal ball on that. I think I'm going to go now. I'm really hungry for lunch too. So,
Joey, how about you? What impact do you think the election will have?
I would say there are two things that we need to be thinking about and looking at as we head into debate season. One is going to be what form does any additional stimulus take, whether that happens before the election, if we get a stimulus package in the spring after either President Trump is reelected or we see a new administration come in. What does that look like? That's one thing. And then secondly, particularly if we see Biden come into office, there have been some proposals on tax increases for at the corporate level for capital gains and for income. But that, I think there's not necessarily going to be much political momentum for that, at least in the short run, because with the economy still hurting, I think that's going to be an uphill climb for them to pass anything significant there. At least in 2021. Again, I don't want to speculate too much. I'm not a political scientist, but I think those are the two major elements that we need to be thinking about in terms of how they would affect the economy. But clearly that's going to depend because, we could see a situation where we have, multi-party control where everything is split. The White House and Congress are different parties, and then you see a lot of gridlock or maybe not. So a lot of uncertainty. But those are two things that I would say we need to be thinking about in terms of its short-run implications for economic activity.
Okay. I think we have one more question. Jessica, I think this was about your slide that you had on the difference between racial home ownership rates. There was a question about if you see any difference between, single African-American, single Asian, single Hispanic, and single white ownership instead of, comparing that to multiple family home ownership rates. Do you have that data? Do you see any differences?
I'm racking my brain to know if the census actually has the homeownership rates broken down by both race and then household composition. And I don't think that they do. And I also don't think that the wealth, and Joey may have it better off the top of his head, but I don't think that census or the Federal Reserve breaks it down that way. That being said, there are measures from the American Community Survey, and we've actually done some analysis looking at breaking down those types of factors. And I'll send a link along with my presentation so that you guys can send that out. One of our brilliant economists on staff has actually essentially done this by state and also has like drop downs of buyers. Now, this is not going to be homeowners overall, so it's not necessarily the same thing, but it should be interesting at least to play around with.
Okay. Joe, do you know anything about that data point or?
No, I don't really have any additional insight beyond what Jessica said.
Yeah. All right. And so we're almost at our time. So once again, I want to thank both of you for joining us today. Everybody on here, our partnership with the Building Industry Association, the Columbia Chamber of Commerce, and the Lexington Chamber of Commerce for helping us put together this event. We want to thank our sponsors too for all the help. Typically we do this in person. This is our first virtual, meeting. So thank you for all your help today. I think we also have a slide for our social media pages too for each group on here. So, make sure to follow each group for more information and data, and see what we're doing to help our members. We'll see if we can get the slides and presentations from Dr. Von Essen and Dr. Lautz to share with our members. This has been recorded and will be sent out so you guys can all watch it again and if in case you've missed something. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and with that we'll end the meeting.
Thanks everyone.